So do you ever run into your napkin art disappearing? If you're like me, sometimes you have this beautiful dark background and you think it's going to be fantastic for your napkins, but sometimes they will disappear or they'll lighten so much it'll be hard to see the image on your art journal page. So today I want to share with you my top techniques for how I salvage these pages and make them beautiful and be able to still end up with a gorgeous project at the end. So let's get started. So we'll be starting with a dark background for this project. This background was created in last week's video, which I've linked below in the description. So check that out if you'd like to know how I did this beautiful layering technique. So I want to start by adding layers of poppy napkins onto the surface. And so the first thing you need to do is separate them out. And I have done a video that goes into a lot of detail about napkins and basically how to apply them to your project. You can see that video also below in the description. I've also linked that so that if you're brand new to napkin art and how to use napkins in your art journal, you can check out that video. So we're just taking apart the layers, and I always find a little bit of masking tape really helps me get those last two layers apart. Sometimes I can get them with my finger, but a lot of the time, just using that little piece of masking tape to help divide them in that last step really goes a long way for making sure I get really good results. And so now we're down to our one layer of napkin, and that's what we're going to want to add to our project. And if you're new to napkin art, just so you realize, any of the areas that are white will basically disappear into the background as we add them to the art journal page. But before I add them onto the page, I want to trace around a few of these. So in this case, I want to take this napkin, which you'll notice with a napkin that it usually has a mirror image on the other side. Sometimes they're a quarter image, sometimes they're a half image like this. And so basically what I'm doing is I'm adding a little bit of water to my brush and I'm going around the images. I'm not being super careful about where I add them, more just because of the fact that by the time we add the matte medium, you're not going to see the white areas, but I don't want to have a cut image. Anytime you use a cut image with a napkin, what I find is you do see that slight line from the edges. And so basically I'm just really quickly just taking apart these two pieces of napkin. And now I'm going to look at my art journal page and decide how I want to lay these out. So with this one, I'm going to have more than one layer. So instead of just having a layer along the bottom, I want to have a second layer along the top. And so I'm going to have to do a little bit more work with the water and the brush because I want to get rid of these edges here. I want to get rid of this edge here because those are the areas that will become quite obvious when I start adding in my matte medium. And I'll have to do the same thing along here. I'm going to add in a couple more little spots as well. I always like using matte medium when adding napkins to an art journal page. I find that it just gives really good coverage. It has a really nice feel to it. It doesn't damage the napkins. And the biggest thing is when you're working in an art journal, you don't want anything that's too slick or too shiny because what ends up happening is that your pages will stick together. You can see here that even on this painted background, because I used a lot of gloss paint, what I ran into is the pages stuck together when I closed it. So sometimes what you need to do is add a piece of parchment paper in between just to prevent your pages from sticking together. We're going to start by adding a little bit of matte medium on the page. And so I like adding it in a full area, but I only work at it in sections. I don't put the entire amount of matte medium that I require for the entire page down. This allows me to work in sections and prevents a lot of really uneven spots. So what I've done is I've just very gently pressed this to the page. You don't want to press too hard. You press too hard and you're going to start ripping your image. So you can see that over the black, that's gotten quite dark already. But that's okay. I personally chose a really dark background on purpose just to show you what you can do to bring back these images. And this is where you can decide where you want your next set of napkin images. You can have a lot of overlap to make it look like a really busy poppy field. You can also choose to have a little less overlap. I'm going to kind of go down the middle and have some areas overlapping, but not everything overlapping. If I was going to do this again, now that I've put it down, I would have actually gone around a lot more of the images a lot more carefully, just so that I have a little bit more refinement in my images. So you might look at this and you might like it. For me, I find it a little bit dark. So I'm going to start by showing you a couple of things that I like to do to fix this. So the nice thing about napkins is I usually try to at least have a couple napkins of one type if I'm doing a larger layout like this. And the reason for that is if you have ones that aren't necessarily showing up as nicely as you'd like, the thing you can do is gently line them up and add them on top. But what this is going to do is that's going to help that second layer of color on top of the first layer is going to help it stick out a little bit more. And this is where you got to watch those white areas, because I'm realizing I should have cut out a few more of those white areas before doing this. And now you can see, now we have an image that isn't falling nearly as much to the background. Instead, it's sticking out really nicely and you're being able to see it really, really well. So that area that was kind of muddled, it was really hard to see. Now you can see it quite a bit better. And I shouldn't be going over this again. I noticed that napkin was starting to rip, but now that I've lined them up nicely to each other, now with that second layer of color, that area that's on black, that'd be really hard to see, you now have more definition. But we also have an area down here that's kind of running into the same issue. Because I added in some black spray paint, it's really faded away. But this is where I'm going to go about it slightly differently. I'm going to add in a little bit of a white wash of paint. So I have a little bit of Amsterdam paint here, and I'm just taking a little bit of it and I'm washing it down. I'm not putting it on super dark. I'm adding it on top. And this is something you can do. If you know you have a dark area and you're going to put some napkins on, you can always start by just adding in a white background in that area, or just really lighten the background in that area. And it's going to help your images pop a little bit more. But in this case, I want to show you what will happen if we just add in a little bit of a wash of white. What's nice about doing it this way is that you know exactly the area that you want to add in your next image on top of. And just make sure you do have another napkin that you're able to use for this. And so often when I get napkins, I usually get them from places like Nini's Napkins, where I can get them in sets of 2. And that means I always have enough for a project like this. And then you just want to let that paint dry a little bit, just so it doesn't smear. I'm going to line this up. And what's nice about this is now you can actually see the general shape of where it should be. Make sure I line it up correctly. Again, because I have a dark corner here, I'm going to try to tear a little bit, get rid of those extra areas. I'm going to tore my napkin a little bit. That's okay. You can see how much brighter that is. It's almost too bright for what I've done, but I just really wanted to show you just how far you could take this. Because now it's so bright, it actually almost looks a little bit strange next to the rest of them. I'm just gonna get rid of as much of that white as possible. And areas like this, again, especially if you've let the background dry, you can basically gently pull with your finger. Because if all the other areas are dry, tearing around the napkin a little bit with your finger won't hurt the rest of your project, because everything is dried and adhered with the matte medium. So I'm also gonna do this over this area as well. I realized that this is where I really want my main focal image to be. I want it to be really obvious. So I'm going to take a couple minutes and just clean up the edges of the white here and then add it onto my project. So with this one, I've taken a little bit of time to kind of go over the images, take out a little bit more of that white. And now it's just a matter of lining it up as closely as I can. And if you've enjoyed what you've seen so far, please like this video. Every time you like a video, that just helps more people see it. And that just helps my channel get just a little bit more exposure. So thank you so much for your support. And so when you add in that second area of napkin, what you'll notice that the white areas are even whiter than they were before. So just to be aware that that is going to happen. So you want to make sure it's fully dry. You want to be able to run your hands over it and have nothing tear. And now we're going to look at adding in some highlights, some different paints, and figure out ways you can really help these colors pop a little bit. And so I'm going to add in a little bit of Amsterdam Parallel Red to my palette. You don't need a lot of paint for this. The intent with this is not to put on a super thick layer of paint. The idea is to have just a little bit of muted wash color just to help bring the color out on the images a little bit more. So I'm not doing it everywhere. I'm just maybe adding it to one main area. So that's almost too thick of paint. I really want to go on really, really gentle, because what you want to do is you don't want to lose all of those black areas that you've added in. You don't want to lose a lot of the shape that the napkin's giving you. Because the idea is that the napkin basically can be your focal image and can add in some really beautiful color. With this one, because it's so much lighter than everything else, I'm actually going to add in some color just to darken it just a tiny bit. Again, I'm not adding it to all the places. I'm thinking more the darker areas just to help it feel like it's a little bit more part of the rest of the image. And some of these can be quite dark, so sometimes it's really nice to add in just a little bit more areas of color. And especially if you're new to painting or you're new to art journaling, this is a really great way of adding in some beautiful images. And then even painting on top of them, you can learn a lot about painting itself. And by making sure you thin out your paint, because if you did a big glob of paint on this, you would lose all of the color that you added. It allows you to kind of add in color, add in accents without it taking over and obliterating the image that you've spent so much time putting on. So I feel like that's already a little bit better. And I might just want to add that to a few of these other spots. Even though we've added other napkins on and it looks really good, sometimes it's just fun to try to bring a little bit of color harmony by just adding a little bit of those spots on every single poppy. Brightens it up a little bit. Because the hard thing with the dark backgrounds is you want to add images, but then they can really disappear easily. So this is why I wanted to show you these few different techniques. So you really do want to try to darken some of those areas that you have some of that white napkin showing through. And I've never actually done a project on a background quite this dark, so I'll be honest, I was surprised just how much that white napkin shows through on the dark colors. So I'm going to adjust some of that background just to adjust for that as well. And already I feel like that's really improving things. And again, you don't want a super dark wash. You want a very light wash. And that way you can just build up color over having all of your color disappear. And on the areas like this, where the colors were a lot lighter, we need to do a little less of that, just because the colors are showing up really nicely on their own. Anyways, I kind of like the brush strokes that come with painting, like adding them to my art journal page. I think it adds a little bit of variation, a little bit of texture, and that's just a particular look that I really like. So we've basically been adding in our mids back in a little bit. And now you can probably go in with white or something, but what I like using is this iridescent medium. So basically this iridescent medium is sparkle, without any color in it. I love using this when adding in some more color. I like adding this into my napkin images for a little bit of sparkle, and it also works really well when you've lost a few of those highlights. So then basically you go to all those light areas and you just add in a little bit of shimmer. And there I've gone way too much with that. So you can always just pick it up with your brush or wipe it off with a baby wipe. Ones like this, they're a little bit darker. This is a great place you can go over with quite a bit of this bright medium, and it can go quite a ways for just helping this shine a little bit more. And if you're new to drawing or painting flowers and you have a hard time figuring out how to draw or paint flowers, this is a nice way of being able to almost trace or paint over some of these areas. It shows you kind of how the shape of the flower works. So you can see how like a little bit of this iridescent medium goes a really long way. And I like adding places like this just throughout all of them, even if they're not completely falling to the background, more just because then you have a little bit of color harmony. Sometimes you'll notice like, oh, well, it's missing on that flower. And sometimes you don't want to have colors that look like they're missing or they're kind of out of place. Okay, and so now we've added a lot of those highlights, and I think that adds a lot to this background. And now I would like to go and fix the background itself a little bit, because I'm noticing there's a lot of areas where that white's coming through and I find it kind of distracting. So I'm using this dioxazine purple from Golden. It's a high flow paint. So you want to give it a shake, the lid on. I learned that a few weeks ago when I got paint all over my art space because I forgot to close the lid. We're just adding just a little bit. I'm going to move to a slightly bigger brush for this. And because this is so pigmented, you basically can turn this into a really brilliant wash without too much difficulty. And now I'm basically going over some of these areas and I'm doing what's called negative painting. So by adding in a little bit of that purple, that brings that back to a little bit closer to the black color that we had. But I didn't necessarily want to go completely with black. I might still add in a few spots later on. But right now, I'm just going to go around it. And so basically, whenever you use negative painting, basically you're going around the subject. You're not painting the subject itself, you're painting around the subject. So if you ever hear the word negative painting, you don't know what that means, that's pretty much what it is. So yeah, we are losing some of that really beautiful, unique background that we had. But this way, at least, it's making it look a little bit more harmonious. And I'm kind of working up to it. Like, you'll notice that I'm not going on super deep with these colors. And I'm brush stroking out basically to the very top, just so that there isn't really a strong line. I want this to really meld back into the background that I already have. Just continue to do this until you've added in the amount of color that you want. And closer to the bottom, I'm probably going to do a little bit darker. Again, you can go in more with just the straight color if that's what you're looking for. Kind of depends on the look that you're looking to create from this. You may want something a little bit more subtle. You may want something a little bit darker. And the nice thing about adding this in washes and layers is now by adding in washes and layers, I'm pulling up some of the darker color, like in here. You can see that darker color a little bit better than what you did because it's no longer getting covered as much with a napkin. So by adding small layers of things can go a long way for just adding like a little bit better color balance to this. And I'm just going to add in just a little bit more to these darker areas below. I just really want it to be that we're moving from dark to light. And by doing that, you're noticing too that now we're getting a lot more contrast in the colors that we've added. And I think that's really where I wanted to go with this, is trying to create a little bit more contrast to things and just to let certain colors stick out a little bit more. And so sometimes you see that maybe you've lost a little bit of a color that you want to have be a little bit more prevalent. So for example, all those green stems, I've lost a tiny bit of their shine. So I'm just going to again go in with a little bit of that iridescent medium and just add in a little bit of edges to some of these little guys. And then that way they're going to stick out a little bit more on the page. Because you can adjust and adjust and adjust, or you could really just add them in, add in a few things to kind of help them pop a bit and call it done. I really wanted to take this a little bit further just to show you just how far you can take it and how much you can adjust. Because you might go, well, I've ruined my background. No, you haven't. You just need to adjust it a little bit and just help it get the rest of the way. And sometimes I don't want to cover the whole stem, so I'll put them next to the stems. And that just helps them shine as well too. That almost brings a little bit of highlight to those edges. So they're disappearing a little less on the page. And if you have areas like here where you're feeling like almost things are disappearing a little bit too much, you can also add a little bit of that iridescent medium just to help accent and outline those areas where there's a little bit more shine so you get a stronger edge to it. Some of these areas that have had a little bit too much of the napkin show through. By just adding a little bit of that iridescent medium, it just hides some of those lines a little bit more. And as long as you kind of blend it out, then it works pretty well. So I'm just going to add in a little bit of the Stablio All pen. And what this does is this is a pen that works on paper, glass, plastic, or metal. And it's also water soluble. So I will show you a few examples of how you can use this. So for example, I find this area here. I want that a little bit darker. Maybe I want a little bit more of a shadow there. I can add in a little bit of the pencil and that looks great. But then you can come in with a little bit of water and you can mix it out. And now you can see how deep that color gets. And then you can basically just tease it out along the edge here. And that can be a way you can start adding in a little bit more shadow. And I can do the same thing here. And I'm just going to add in a little bit of a wet brush. It's not sopping wet. It's just a little bit wet just to help pull that detail out a little bit more and give it a little bit more definition. On a couple of these center areas, the poppies have kind of lost that little bit of shine. So then just add it in and just brush it out. I have another spot here. That's kind of the same thing. I've added in a little bit too much iridescence. So I'm just going to add that in and that just pulls that out again. And so by going around and finding any areas that look like they're disappearing a little much, like right in here, add in a little bit of a wet brush. And that's just going to bring that little bit of stronger color back into those. So you can see by adding highlights and lowlights and then also choosing areas that maybe you just want a little bit darker. Like maybe you just want to add in a little bit of shadow here. By adding the shadows next to the highlights, you get a lot more definition because of the light and the dark next to each other. And if you wet your surface and then brush into it, this pencil will also work on wet surfaces. Or you can even just take a little bit of color off the tip like this and add it in. And that can be just a really great way of hiding some of those white areas that maybe you really don't like. And then this being underneath it is a great place where you can just add in that tiny bit of shadow. So you can see there's lots of options for being able to fix this and just have it look just that little bit better by just adding in a few layers. Because this went from being really blah to being quite contrasting and beautiful. So I know this has been a bit of work. So what can you do to prevent this type of thing from happening? One, you can work on a lighter background. For example, this layout here that I have, I basically started at the top and made it very light and had a little bit of watercolor color at the bottom. But you can see just even as that is, some of that color starts kind of getting a little bit more muted. So by sticking with lighter watercolor washes, when you start adding in color, that can go a long way. The other option is choosing the right napkin. For example, here is a page that I did with a very light colored napkin. That one's actually this napkin. And so if you put it on anything besides white, which I did, I found that all of those areas that are light colored or white basically disappeared. By putting it on a darker background, I found a lot of my color disappeared. I did the same thing with the Stablio all pencil and the iridescent medium. I added a lot of highlights. I had some dark areas, and I basically painted around some of these objects just so it gets a little bit lighter. Another option is this one here, where I ended up having too dark of a background. I added in some gold pen, I added in some gold foiling, and that helped pull it from the background. I also negative painted around all of these individual flowers just to help them stick out more from the surface. So again, there's lots of ways you can go about it, but I think the key is choosing the right napkin. So for example, for this one, I was choosing between the poppies or this one. The main reason these had a lot of red and dark colors, they were going to work really well. Any napkin that has a lot of black on it is going to work really well because that black isn't going to disappear. All the white areas will. So this one you could almost put on a white background and then paint in a bunch of your color into these images and still have a really strong overall image. And that's the reason for a lot of these ones. To get those vibrant colors, you need to stick with a lot of a lighter background. But I wanted to show you what you could do when you maybe put on too dark of a background and how you can adjust it. And so some of it is choosing the right napkin, realizing that anything with a strong border, anything with really strong color is going to hold up a lot better. Anything that's super light, like this, you should really be doing on almost a white background. So I hope this has been useful for you and that this has given you lots of ideas on how to fix your napkins in your art journal pages. Because I think this has turned out pretty well, all things considered. Considering what a dark background we started with, I think I did a really great job being able to pull back some of that color and be able to have the images really stick out in a beautiful way. And so always remember, your project isn't ruined just because your napkin didn't go down correctly. There's lots of ways you can fix it and adjust it. And by putting a little bit of mindfulness into what napkins you use and how they're going to work on the background, it's going to go a long way to make sure you have great results. And so if you've enjoyed this video, if you could like it, subscribe, and just hit that notification button so you don't miss out on any future videos. And if you're interested in any of the supplies I used today, just look at the description below. I've included all of my materials. And anytime you click on one of those affiliate links, that just helps support this channel at no additional cost to you. So thank you so much for your support. And if you're looking for another video about napkins, click here. This is another one that I did recently about napkins and using napkins in the art journal. So I'll see you in that next video.